Australia's prisoner past, how it all began. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today we are diving into one of the most fascinating, shocking, and honestly unbelievable stories in human history. How Australia actually began as a land of prisoners. Yes, you heard that right. The country we know today for its beaches, kangaroos, and beautiful lifestyle started with ships full of British convicts. So stick around till the end of this video because by the time you finish watching, you will never look at Australia's early history the same way again. And before we jump in, don't forget to subscribe, like and comment below if you have ever wondered how your ancestors or early settlers ended up here. If you already know a story about this topic, maybe something from your local museum or family history, share it in the comments. Let's make this discussion an interesting one. Alright, let's travel back in time, not just a few decades, but more than 230 years ago. When Australia was not yet the Australia we know today, back then it was an unknown, distant land on the edge of the world. And the British had a problem, a very overcrowded, noisy problem. Britain in the late 1700s was running out of prison space. Imagine old, crumbling jails full of people for even tiny crimes, stealing a loaf of bread, picking a pocket, or even cutting down a tree from someone's land. The country was in chaos. Prisons were so overcrowded that the British started locking prisoners inside ships floating in the river Thames called prison hulks. You can picture it, dirty, rotten, disease-filled boards lined with men chained together. It wasn't exactly five-star accommodation. But the British government had another big problem: what to do with all these prisoners. For many years, they had been sending convicts to America, but after the American Revolution, that option disappeared. The Americans had just kicked them out, and they weren't going to say, "Sure, send us your criminals again." So Britain needed a new dumping ground for its convicts, and that's when someone looked at a map and said, there is the big empty land down here called New Holland. Maybe we can send them there." Of course, empty was not true. That land was already home to hundreds of indigenous nations who had lived here for over 16,000 years. But to the British, it was just a blank space ready for colonization. In 1787, the British made their move. They sent 11 ships, known as their First Fleet, on a long and dangerous journey to the other side of the world. The fleet carried about 1,400 people, including more than 700 convicts, along with sailors, officers, and some families. It took them over 8 months to reach their new home. Imagine being on a wooden ship for 8 months, no Netflix, no toilets, and the smell of hundreds of people who haven't bathed properly for weeks. Lovely. When the fleet finally arrived in January 1788, they landed at Botany Bay, which didn't look too promising. The soil was poor and the water wasn't good for drinking, so they moved further north to a more suitable place, Sydney Cove, and that's where the first British colony in Australia was founded. And just like that, Australia's prisoner past officially began. Now, you might imagine a dramatic moment with the British flag waving proudly and everyone cheering, but the reality was far from that. The first settlers struggled terribly. They didn't know how to farm in this new climate. They ran out of food, and some of them almost starved to death. Even the animals were strange: kangaroos that hopped, birds that laughed, and plants they had never seen before. The convicts were forced to work from sunrise to sunset, building huts, roads, and farms under very harsh conditions. Some were treated cruel by their guards. Others managed to earn trust and small freedoms. It wasn't slavery, but it wasn't freedom either. It was a rough life of punishment and survival. And while all this was happening, the indigenous people who had lived here for thousands of generations were pushed off their land, attacked, or killed by disease brought by the newcomers. It was a time of massive change, conflict, and tragedy for the First Nations people, a dark part of the story that must never be forgotten. But let's go back to the convicts. Not everyone who was sent here was dangerous. In fact, many were ordinary men and women who had simply been unlucky. Poor people stealing food to survive, teenagers caught picking pockets, even mothers who took bread for their children. Some sentences were absurd by today's standards. Imagine getting 7 years transportation for stealing a handkerchief. And guess what? Those people ended up shaping the foundations of the new colony. They built roads, farms, bridges, and even some of the oldest buildings you can still see in Sydney today. Convict labour built much of early Australia. By the early 1800s, the British realized Australia wasn't just a dumping ground. It was valuable. They started expanding colonies beyond New South Wales to places like Tasmania, then called Van Diemen's Land, Queensland, and Western Australia. Each of these colonies used convict labor in different ways. Van Diemen's Land became one of the harshest convict colonies. Port Arthur was infamous, a place for the worst of the worst. If you misbehaved there, they put you in solitary confinement, in total silence. Some prisoners said the silence made them go mad. Then there was Norfolk Island, paradise on the outside, nightmare on the inside. It was another convict settlement known for brutal punishment. But strangely, some convicts who behaved well were later rewarded with land and became farmers or business owners. So Australia's early years were full of contradictions, cruelty, and opportunity side by side. Over time, the number of free settlers grew. They came looking for land, work, and a new life. And slowly, the colonies became more than just prisons. They became communities. By the 1820s and 1830s, cities like Sydney and Hobart were growing. Convicts still existed, but many were now skilled workers, carpenters, blacksmiths, cooks, and even teachers. Funny enough, some Australians today might discover that their great-great-grandparents were convicts, and instead of shame, it's now seen as part of proud history, because those early convicts helped build a nation from nothing. Transportation of convicts to New South Wales officially ended in 1840, and in Tasmania a little later in 1853. Western Australia, though, continued the practice until 1868. The last ship of convicts arrived that year. After nearly 80 years, the era of convict transportation was finally over. But here's where it gets interesting. By that time, gold had been discovered in Australia, and suddenly people from around the world rushed here to seek fortune. The land once known for punishment became known for opportunity. It is kind of ironic. A place that started as a prison ended up being a dream destination. Today, millions move to Australia for freedom, safety, and a better life. What a twist of history, right? When you look at modern Australia, the skyscrapers, universities, beaches, and beautiful cities, it is hard to believe it all began with ships full of prisoners. Yes, that's the fascinating truth. Those convicts, those guards, those settlers, they all played a part in turning this place into what it is today. Of course, we must remember the indigenous perspective too. The British arrival brought devastating consequences for Aboriginal people, loss of land, culture, and countless lives. Many historians today focus on telling those stories to balance the record. Understanding the full truth makes us appreciate the present more deeply. Life was truly harsh. Convicts could be whipped, starved, or forced into back-breaking work. Yet, many of them transformed. When their sentence ended, some stayed and built lives here. Their children became free citizens. Australia slowly evolved from punishment to pride. By the late 1800s, transportation was long gone, and a new Australia was taking shape, full of immigrants, gold miners, farmers, and dreamers. People started identifying not as British, but as Australians. The land that once symbolized punishment became a land of opportunity. So when you walk through Sydney today and see all sandstone buildings like Hyde Park Barracks or the Rocks area, you are literally walking on history built by prisoners. Each stone tells a story of hardship, survival, and hope. And that's why this story matters. It is not just about criminals or punishment. It is about how people, even in the toughest situations, can create something lasting. Australia's prisoner past remind us that history can change direction. from darkness to light. So, what do you think? Did you already know that Australia began as a convict colony? Or did this story surprise you? Comment below and share your thoughts or any local stories you have heard about early Australian settlements. Maybe your area has a historical prison site or a famous convict built bridge. Tell us in the comments. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories about Australia, from its history to its culture, travel, sports, and everyday life. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this story, and let's keep exploring together how this amazing country became what it is today. Bye. Thank you.